Today we're going to be talking about creating depth in your painting, and we're using 3 photographs here, and we're talking particularly about photographs, although I think the same would hold true with being outside. We never want to just copy exactly what we see. We always want to interpret what we see and mix colors that suggest, in this case, depth or light or shadow. Because when we copy, we tend to focus on one area, and if I'm focusing back in here, in that area, and I just try and match what I see exactly if I'm outside painting, it's not going to relate to the other values around it because I'm just focusing on one spot at a time. So I always want to compare values, but I also just don't want to copy what I see either. I want to create or mix colors that suggest the depth that I want in there. So be a little bit more creative with the colors to suggest what you want to suggest. Don't just try and copy the photograph. Because I think we could all, if we try long enough, could painstakingly copy this exactly as it is. But I've never had the goal of wanting to just copy what I see. So we're always interpreting, simplifying, and not copying. So I've got 3 photographs here. This one's in Tetons. And this actually has pretty good value change. Your darkest darks are up here. Darks are a hair lighter back in here, not much. That's one of the things that flattens out about this, is that there's not enough value change between these darks and these darks. There is back in here value-wise, but color-wise, still a bit warm, maybe. I want to create more depth than what's there, so I might want to cool down this green a bit more. It could still be a yellow green. I don't necessarily have to change the green to a different color from the color wheel, but I should, I think, cool it off a bit more. And again, that's more about interpreting. Same thing with the darks in here. They're a lot smaller than the darks up here, but they're not much different value-wise. You can see some of these little darks way up here. They're about as dark as this in here. So that really flattens things out and kills the idea of depth. So we want to separate those values a lot more and also create more warm and cool color to suggest depth. So my first change here is, you can see I give a little more color and value change to those darks. These are all the darks. They're all kind of small. They're not very big. But the darks up here, darkest, and I've lightened them a little bit here, slightly cooler. And then I've lightened them and grayed them and cooled them back in here. Then as I go back further, till back in here I could probably use more of a slightly muted blue just back in there. But I do want a definite change from the foreground to the background, value-wise and color-wise. And sometimes, like in this photograph, it does a fairly good job at the value, but the colors are still too warm in the distance. A little bit of change. So color-wise, on top of these darks, I'm going to have my strongest greens here. Then I'm going to get up this cooler yellow-green back in here. And this could be cad yellow light and blue with a little bit of violet in it. Not much cadmium yellow light, because the light's one of the first colors that fades in the distance. And same thing with the light on the pine trees back in here. They are darker than the grass on the slanted hill. And they're also going to be a bit more muted, or a lot more muted than these greens up front. So using those colors, and I'm not looking to match necessarily at all, but I want that difference between this yellow green and that yellow green, or this one and that one. There's a big jump there in temperature. So getting that relationship between the background greens and foreground greens is the main thing. Not copying what I see, but getting that relationship right. This is another one in the Tetons. And again, the values right in here are just as dark as there. There's just no depth in there at all. So I have to change it. And you have to get away from suggesting or copying what you see. This is a bit lighter, but I'd still want to change the temperature. This green is too much the same green as up in here or in there. And same thing back in here. There's really no difference here than here. I want to mix colors and values that could create a bit more depth. So here, starting with the shadows, this is my darkest accent is right in here, back in the distance. And it doesn't look much different, but it's lighter than this one. So if it doesn't look different, it doesn't work. So I would lighten that up, or that might be what's there. I just didn't fill it in enough. So this is my darkest right here, and this is my darkest up here. And I've got a pretty good jump value-wise and temperature-wise. And then the darks are even lighter back in here and lighter and bluer back in there. So I'm looking at those 4 areas. 1, 2, 3, 4, because those are the trees. And as they recede back, how they get lighter and cooler. And it's not a matter of mixing a color that looks like trees. It's a matter of mixing a color here that looks like it recedes back from this color. And I want the color to look like paint. I don't want it to look like the photograph. Photograph color is pretty lousy. So even if you enhance it, it's still going to look photographic. Learn what you can mix with the colors on your palette. Be more creative with color. Don't just copy it. And then in the lights, my strongest yellow-green with a cad yellow light with a little bit of blue or viridian. Maybe a tiny bit of the complement, but not much. Same color here, cad yellow light and blue, a little bit more of the complement and more white. So I get a jump in here in value and intensity. This is still warm, but not nearly as warm as the foreground. And then as I recede back, I would even leave the lights off back in here. It's just too far away. It reads better if it's just a simple dark. If I see mostly light, I would put a light in here, in there. But if I see mostly dark, I'm just going to put the dark in there. I should have a lot less contrast in the distance than in the foreground, and the most contrast is in here. A little bit difference also in the shadows in the foreground. The shadow here on these rocks has a bit of orange in it. So this is the equivalent of ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson and white to make a blue violet. Then I added orange, wiped most of it off. Well, I didn't use a brush, but I would use a brush. Wipe most of it off and scrub it into the blue violet. Obviously I did it with a computer stylus. It's not as easy to blend on the computer, but I would blend that orange in just a bit more so that the shadow here is still cool because it's shadow and this is sunlight here, but this shadow is warmer than the shadow back in here. I got this a lot bluer back in here, and I won't make it, or blue violet, I won't scrub in the orange back in here like I did in front. And that gives me a difference in the shadows. While the shadows are always cool in the absence of sunlight, they are warmer in the foreground. Still cool, but warmer in the foreground than they are in the background. And that's what I have on the flat plane here of these rocks. Keep your things simple. And always, everything I do here, I'm relating it to the foreground. Never isolate and mix values and colors, because then you'll lose your depth. So this color, when I mixed it, I made sure how it looked compared to that color. So that it was bluer, it receded back, it was the right value, or the value I wanted. I might want to push it back even further, so get it even lighter. So anything to get away from the photo. The other would be to just use a black and white photo instead of a color, and kind of see what you know about color. Using temperature, again, to push things back, and warmer temperature to pull things forward. The last one here is also in the Tetons. And I will, and most of these, I took the photo because of the composition and the light, but all of them lack a lot of depth. Now the mountains back in here go back pretty far because they're very blue. And that works pretty well. What doesn't work at all is the greens back in here are just the same as these greens, just the same as these greens. The darkened light of all those. So, again, I need to create some depth in there that the photograph does not give me. So what I did here, and just starting back in here, got this a hair lighter blue, because I want to, that right there, a hair lighter than what it was in the reference, because I want to be able to get more contrast between here and here. And I went a lot more blue with as little yellow as possible, and maybe a touch of red or orange just to slightly mute it. And same color, just a bit darker, less white, not much more yellow. These are shadows, but they have to be darker than back there. Also, I'm not worried about putting much sunlight right here. It reads better as a dark. I could put some sunlight, but it might be getting too much contrast. You know, there is sunlight on that tree, but might read better just as a dark. And then start adding the lights here and in here and in here. But the more simple you can keep the background, especially in the shadows, the better. And my dark accents got darker and cooler as they go back. So this is the farthest away dark accent. This is the overall dark, and this is the darkest dark. You can see it's darker there and darkest up here. So that value change creates more depth as well as the temperature. Shadows getting bluer as they go back. And you can see the light areas also. If I can create stronger yellows, yellow greens, yellow oranges in the foreground, then as I lighten up and slightly cool the lights as they go back, I'm going to create distance. So it's not just a matter about making things blue in the background. It's also making sure the lights in the foreground are a lot warmer. So you get that push and pull, that contrast of warmer in the foreground and cooler in the background. So when I'm looking at a reference or if I'm outside, I'm really going through that thought process of how many layers do I have to go back? In other words, this one has distant mountains, trees here, and then these two. So I've got about 4 layers of trees. And as I'm drawing, I'm realizing I want to create a distance or a depth or a difference between those layers. And that means getting away from copying and doing more comparing and pushing the color and value to create the depth you need.